Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Of all the early philosophers of ancient Greece, Heraclitus of Ephesus, who flourished in around the end of the 6th century, is one of the most enigmatic and yet one of the most important. Almost nothing is known of the life of Heraclitus, although, as I said, we can say with certainty that he was born in the 6th century BC and flourished until the end of the into the beginning of the 5th century. Little is known of his life, and the details that are given to us by his biographer Diogenes Laertius, writing in the 3rd century AD, can all be characterized as late, anecdotal, and unreliable. In fact, and this is a tendency among a lot of biographers of the ancient world, he seems to just really extrapolate a lot of details from the writings that we have, kind of seeking to sort of fill in, perhaps just through pure fiction, some of the things that the details that those writings suggest. What we do know for sure is that he grew up in Ephesus, which was one of the wealthiest and most opulent cities of the ancient Near East in Asia Minor, at a time when it was being governed by the Persians, which would come to an end in the later on in the 5th century, but during his time they were still under Persian rule. His family was aristocratic, and yet he seems to have stood outside of the world of politics and of public life, and indeed had a rather strong dislike for those who ran his city. But his aristocratic vantage and position in society definitely comes across in a good deal of his writings, where he talks about the mob or the many bad ones. As a thinker, he was extremely influenced by the nascent philosophical spirit that had begun in the 6th century, with the thinkers coming from the city of Miletus, just right nearby Ephesus, particularly the thinkers Anaximander and Xenophanes. But of course, also they in turn were deeply influenced by Thales and Anaximenes. In many respects, though, he is so totally unique, even against this backdrop of other pre-Socratic thinkers. And really, any attempts to classify him with those other thinkers really have to draw as much emphasis on the differences between him and them as on any similarities. Heraclitus is said to have written a work Periphuseos, which means on nature. However, if he indeed did write a formal treatise with that title, nothing of it survives except for fragments. And when we say fragments, what we mean are quotations from his writings by later authors whose works did survive. And so we're not talking about physical fragments here of papyrus, but rather quotations by later authors whose works scholars have been able to comb and put together a list of these fragments of a little bit over 120 of them. Now, and all of these fragments have kind of been traditionally numbered, and so that is how we refer to his writings, is by the number of these fragments. Certainly nothing in the fragments suggests that Heraclitus's work fell into the three categories which Diogenes Laertius asserted that his book was categorized into, namely cosmology, politics, and theology. These categories are certainly a reflection of later codifying tendencies in philosophy, when the ideas of philosophers tended to be grouped into such categories. But the one thing that comes across very clearly from his writing is that his writing is extremely aphoristic, extremely obscure, and hard to penetrate. He writes very much in these short, pithy little aphorisms that are very, very hard to interpret. And in fact, because his writing style and his thought are so impenetrable to some degree, he had the nickname of the Obscure One in ancient times. And some of these fragments are as long as a couple of sentences, but for the most part, they're very, very short ones. And it's an interesting fact that aside from the direct quotations that we have of Heraclitus, we know that they're direct quotations because they are written in the Ionic dialect of Greek, which is distinct from, say, Attic Greek. There are another source that we have for his thought and his writings are later reminiscences of his. That is, when later thinkers, particularly I'm talking about Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic emperor of Rome, the Stoic philosopher and emperor of Rome. When he writes about Heraclitus said such and such, he writes in very plain, kind of matter-of-fact prose, and the ideas that he ascribes to him are very straightforward. And so the result of all this is that the reader of Heraclitus faces an immediate and major problem that readers of, say, Plato do not face, namely the reconstruction of what Heraclitus actually said, as distinct from what other ancient sources sometimes quote him as saying. And a lot of scholarly ink has been poured into this question. The language Heraclitus uses and the way he uses it are critically important for understanding his thought, because he seeks to represent in his language, through puns, through deliberate kind of aphorisms and this or oracular almost way of speaking, he seeks to express or even represent through words the complexity and interrelatedness of the universe itself. He is seeking, remember, so if this title On Nature is correct, that is the kind of guiding principle, the organizing principle of all of these fragments. And in the density of Heraclitus's language, a multiplicity of ideas are expressed sometimes in a single word or phrase. And often a relationship between fragments exists by virtue only of a single word or phrase, which is then echoed from one text to another in such a way that the meaning of each is enriched and further explicated when these fragments are understood together as a whole. In other words, his words, his logoi, are a rendering of the underlying cosmic rationality, logos, which he sees permeating the universe. Any account of Heraclitus and of his thought can reasonably begin with his views on the nature of knowledge itself. Is knowledge possible? And if so, under what circumstances and to what extent? The problem had been posed earlier by that philosopher I mentioned, Xenophanes, in his fragment 34, and the response that Xenophanes gave to these questions was a pessimistic one. He said, quote, "There never was nor will be a man who has certain knowledge about the gods and about all the things I speak of. Even if he should chance to say the complete truth, yet he himself knows not that it is so. Seeming, rather, is wrought over all things." For Heraclitus, by contrast, knowledge is not only possible, but its specific and most significant object, the mind, the logos that directs the operations of the universe, in fact embodies the fullness of wisdom. As he says in fragment 41, "One thing is wise, to know the thought that steers all things, permeating all things." Its attainment, that is the attainment of knowledge, is, however, beset with pitfalls, and several fragments alert us to what Heraclitus feels these pitfalls are. An uncritical acceptance of what passes for knowledge among popular poets or the ordinary run of people, for example, would be one example when he says, quote, "For what thought or wisdom have they? They follow the poets and take the crowd as their teacher, knowing not that there are many bad and few good." This will lead us nowhere, nor will unfocused random conjecturing, as he says in fragment 47, "Let us not conjecture at random about the greatest things." Nor would the piling up of simply unstructured learning, polymathia is the word that he would use, as in fragments 40 and 129, the learning of many things, polymathia, teaches not understanding, or else would it have taught Hesiod and Pythagoras, and again Xenophanes and Hecataeus. Pythagoras, son of Mystarchus, practiced inquiry beyond all other men, and making a selection of these writings, claimed for his own wisdom what was but a knowledge of many things and an impostor. The apparent obviousness of the connectedness of certain things is a poor basis for a serious claim to knowledge, in other words. Apparent connections hold more firmly than do obvious ones. The unseen harmony is better than the visible, Heraclitus says. Like the apparently obvious, a feeling of comprehension of certain states of affairs, even when bolstered by direct experience, is also an unreliable basis for a claim of knowledge. As in fragment 17, the many do not take heed of such things as those they meet with, nor do they mark them when they are taught, though they think they do. Much more is needed to avoid self-deception. Uncritical reliance on the senses will frequently let us down unless the process is directed by what Heraclitus calls a comprehending soul. As in fragment 46 and 107, self-conceit is a falling sickness, that is epilepsy, and eyesight a lying sense. Ears and eyes are bad witnesses to men if they have souls that understand not their language. Getting all worked up over everything attests merely to the stupidity of the soul, for the fool is fluttered at every word. Not to our progress in knowledge is this getting emotionally elevated when something titillates our understanding. In certain areas, not least in matters theological, knowledge should be recognized as impossible of attainment without a concomitant belief or confidence, pistis, the same word that in Christianity is translated as the word faith. As in fragment 86, but the greater part of things divine escape recognition due to lack of confidence, or that is, men's lack of belief. On the positive side, whatever knowledge we can achieve is achievable in certain clear and precise ways. One must first focus on the real nature, physis, of things, and one is most likely to succeed in doing this by paying heed to that which is common, xunon, to all, in the sense that it is common in that it is potentially observable by all. This will involve careful observation, despite the known deceptiveness of the sense of sight, as we just read in fragment 46. Of all the senses, sight and hearing are, however, the most reliable, as in fragment 55. The things that can be seen, heard, and learned are what I prize most. And of these two, sight and hearing, sight is the more reliable one, as in fragment 101a. Of these, sight is, according to Heraclitus, by far the truer, for eyes are surer witnesses than ears. A trustworthy guide to knowledge, therefore, is experience, as in fragment 55. The things that can be seen, heard, and learned are what I prize most. And this is gained by inquiry into a wide range of things, as in fragment 35. Men that love wisdom must be acquainted with very many things indeed, not least of which is knowledge of one's own self. As he says in fragment 101, I searched myself. For self-knowledge, like knowledge of other things, is attainable. He is not a skeptic in that regard. As it says in fragment 116, all men have the capacity to come to know themselves and to have self-control. But two necessary conditions exist for the success of such inquiry, and they are openness to possibilities, as in fragment 18. If you do not expect the unexpected, you will not find it, for it is hard to be sought out and difficult. And the second is patience before difficult tasks, before especially the difficult task of uncovering a reality and truth that lie concealed. Fragment 123 says, nature loves to hide. But of course, it is worth digging up. Fragment 23, men would not have known the name of justice if these things were not. Well, if knowledge is attainable, of what is such knowledge claimed by Heraclitus to be? It is of the content of that universal logos, which, says Heraclitus, holds forever, but of which people forever prove uncomprehending, both before they have heard it and when they have heard it. We read fragment 1. thought perhaps to be the opening sentence of his book. Though this logos is true evermore, yet men are as unable to understand it when they hear it for the first time as before they have heard it at all. For though all things come to pass in accordance with this logos, men seem as if they had no experience of it, when they make trial of words and deeds such as I set forth, dividing each thing according to its nature, and showing how it truly is. But other men know not what they are doing when awake, even as they forget what they do in sleep. Logoi are uttered by persons. Which person, we might ask then, utters this cosmic logos? Well, in broad terms, it is one who has learned wisdom, such as Heraclitus himself. But in the most exact and strict terms, the logos is God. And so Heraclitus gives the name to this logos of the most powerful god that his culture recognized, which was Zeus. But it is very clear that the Zeus that he is talking about here is not the Zeus of mythology. It is simply kind of a placeholder, a name that he gives for this divine logos, this divine reason that permeates all of creation. It is the logos is the wisdom, the principle of wisdom in and of the universe, which at various times he calls that which alone is wise, as in fragment 2. We must follow the common, yet the many live as if they had a wisdom of their own. The wisdom is common, yet the many live as if they had a wisdom of their own. The wise is one only. It is willing and unwilling to be called by the name of Zeus. You see, there it is. That this logos, he says we can call it Zeus in the sense that it is God and it is all powerful, but yet it is not Zeus. It is not the Zeus that we are familiar with from the poets. In other places, he says it is the thunderbolt that steers the course of all things. This is fragment 64. And of course, the thunderbolt was kind of an emblem of Zeus. So again, there's this idea that he's giving it divine status, and yet he's saying it is distinct from the mythological gods. Again, descriptively, the word logos in Greek it means rational account. It means logic. But and when that logic or that rational account is uttered, then it can also mean word. But as a rational account, in terms of what Heraclitus's text is, it is an everlastingly true statement, which describes a reality both everlastingly stable and everlastingly subject to change. Prescriptively, the logos is the divine law, which underpins all human law, as we read in fragment 114. Those who speak with understanding must hold fast to what is common to all, as a city holds to its law, and even more strongly. For all human laws are fed by the one divine law. It prevails as much as it will, and suffices for all things with something to spare. It is this intelligence, we might say it is the intelligence behind the modern phrase of intelligent design that permeates all of the created order, all of the universe, and that feeds the human laws. The human laws are in some sense an emanation of the divine law. Well, this leads to the heart of Heraclitus's whole system, to the content of his logos as statement, listening to which is to listen first to wisdom's own description of the way things have been, are, and always will be, and secondly, to wisdom's own prescription of the norms of conduct, that is, nomos, law. A powerful element in this all-encompassing statement, serving in large measure as a summary of the way things are, is the affirmation that we read in fragment 50, that all things are one, where he says, it is wise to hearken not to me, but to the logos, and to confess that all things are one. Whatever the surface diversity of reality, what makes ultimate sense of it is the unity that underpins it. Such unity in things obtains even though surface investigation might suggest merely the opposite. What opposes, he says, in fact, unites. This is fragment 8. Other forms of unity discoverable by the patient investigator are the unity of inseparability, which he intimates in fragment 57. He see it as most men's teacher. Men think he knew very many things. A man who did not know day or night, they are one. Other forms of unity discoverable by the patient investigator, as I say, are the unity of inseparability, which we see here, and also the unity and identity of essence or nature in the sense of real constitution, which we read in fragment 106. One day is like another. And the unity underpinning differences of perspective, which we might read in fragments 60 and 61. The way up and the way down is one and the same. Hodos ano mia kato. The sea is the purest and the impurest water. Fish can drink it, and it is good for them. To men, it is undrinkable and destructive. A corollary of the unity amid diversity of things is the fact that apparent opposites are, in fact, in some sense, connected. The point is made powerfully, if obliquely, in fragment 67. God is day and night, winter and summer, war and peace, surfeit and hunger, but he takes various shapes, just as fire, when it is mingled with spices, is named according to the savor of each. In this statement, God and the real are taken to be synonymous, and its clear import is that change in the cosmos is never more than the incidental change of what in itself is changeless. A similar statement, couched boldly in terms of identity, runs in fragment 88, and it is the same thing in us that is alive and dead, awake and asleep, young and old. The former are shifted and become the latter, and the latter in turn are shifted and become the former. Many see here a supposed doctrine of the unity of opposites, but Heraclitus's own explication makes it clear that the sameness is one of terminus, attained through a form of change which is cyclical. It's not really a unity of opposites, it's rather a harmony of opposites. For the latter, having changed around, are the former, and the former, having changed around, are back again to being the latter. And we can also see this in fragment 48. The name of the bow is life, but its work is death. And here is a perfect example of that sort of punning quality that is so characteristic of Heraclitus, so hard to translate. The word for life here is bios, as in the word biology, but one of the names for bow, as in a bow and arrow, is bios, you see? And so he's kind of making a pun, saying that the name of the bow is life, but its work is death. And if you take it all together, these statements strongly suggest that for Heraclitus, opposites, such as day and night, are the same, but merely in terms of a given perspective. They do not share a common identity. Day and night, for example, are the same from the perspective of the common substance of the world, of which they are cyclical features. So likewise are, for example, waking and sleeping, and even life and death, from the perspective of an individual of whom they are cyclical features in terms of waking and sleeping. And this fascination on Heraclitus's part with perspective emerges in other fragments as well, as in the one we already read, about seawater being very pure and at the same time very foul water. For fish it is drinkable and life-sustaining, but for men undrinkable and lethal. In other words, one and the same substance can produce different effects on different people or objects. A related point, one would also see this in Heraclitus's fragments 9 and 13. Asses would prefer sweepings to gold, straw to gold, and it is better to delight in the mire than in the clean river. A related point seems to be made elsewhere when he says in fragment 58, doctors who cut and burn the sick complain if they do not receive an appropriate fee for doing these things. In other words, one and the same substance can produce different effects on different people or objects, and something ordinarily considered harmful, like cutting and burning, under other circumstances can be considered beneficial for the same person. That would be like surgery and cauterization. All of this strongly suggests that for Heraclitus, the supposed sameness of opposites, the unity of opposites, a doctrine too often attributed to him, in my opinion, is in fact the much more interesting and defensible doctrine of the interconnectedness of opposites, the harmony of opposites. It is a doctrine expressed with characteristic power and subtlety in a famous fragment that is fragment 51. Men do not know how what is at variance agrees with itself. It is an attunement of opposite tension, like that of the bow or the lyre. Again, the bow here is as in bow and arrow. So when you pull the bow back, that is how you put the arrow going forward. Likewise, when you strike the lyre string in one direction, it bounces back in tension in the opposite direction. This fragment is commonly, and it seems to me rightly, taken as referring to the cosmos. The world is a unity, a functioning whole, like that of the bow or the lyre. The world is forever connected, turning back upon itself in an everlasting process of cyclical change, while losing nothing of its essential nature as the world, just as the bow and lyre are each connected wholes, turned and bent back upon themselves to form that state of balanced tension which makes them what they are. It brings about their function, to shoot an arrow or to make music. In all of these instances, the connectedness of polar opposites or states makes for the unity of the substance in question. For the bow and the lyre, the conjunctive aspect is the taut string, the pulled tight string. For the world is a planned, measured, balanced, predictable, and unending process of change. That's why fire is such an important image for him. The ordered world, he says, the same for all, no god nor man ever made, but it was and is and always will be an ever-living fire, with measures kindling and measures going out. You see, like a fire, you could sit there all night looking at a burning fire, and every lick of flame, every shape that it turns is different, and yet it is always fire. The measures here in this fragment 30 are laid down by that justice, which is surely to be equated with that which alone is wise, of fragment 32. Which is willing and yet unwilling to be called Zeus. The divine logos, in other words. This is what made the unbreakable laws of physics. This is the intelligent design. This is why every day is the same. And it is not that the case that one day is 24 hours long and another day is 50 hours long. Why sometimes the earth spins in one direction and another day it spins in another, but there is regularity, there is order, there is predictability, that the world is a beautifully arranged and rational creation. As he says in fragment 94, the sun will not overstep his measures. If he does, the Erinwes, the handmaids of justice, will find him out. These were these mythological creatures that would drive mad anyone who committed grave injustice. Now, whether the fire of fragment 30, which we just read, is meant to be taken as Heraclitus's basic substance or arche of the cosmos, in the same manner as the previous pre-Socratic thinkers thought. Famously, Thales was said to have thought that water was the arche of the universe, the thing that basically made up everything else. Anaximenes thought it was, Anaximander thought it was a kind of indifferentiated, boundless material, kind of indifferentiated matter. And Anaximenes thought it was air. And other pre-Socratics had different ideas of what the arche was. Aristotle, in his beginning of the metaphysics, catalogs all of this. He may or may not have been correct about his assessment of what these earlier thinkers thought, but it is a debate whether or not Heraclitus's fire was meant to be understood in this arche kind of sense, as being the basic substance that everything else is made up of, or it was really just a metaphor for change, or maybe it was both. Fragment 31a, however, strongly suggests both its substantiality and its status, that is, the fire's substantiality and fire's status, as the physical arche which makes the cosmos the unity that it is, when he says, for instance, quote, "The transformations of fire are first of all sea, and half of the sea is earth, half whirlwind." The process of cosmic transformation is taken to be cyclical in something it seems like that of the Milesian thinkers Anaximander and Anaximenes, which they envisioned for their respective versions of the arche. The transformations of fire are first of all sea, and half of the sea is earth, and half whirlwind. Such change is once again characteristically described in terms of measure and proportion. As we read in fragment 31b, the sea is poured forth from earth and is measured in the same proportion as existed before it became earth. Likewise, fragment 36, "For it is death to souls to become water, and death to water to become earth. But water comes from earth, and from water soul." We will return to the role of the status of Heraclitean fire, as Gerard Manley Hopkins put it so nicely, in a moment. But for now, suffice it to notice that for Heraclitus, stable and changing, being and becoming are clearly non-contradictory properties of the cosmos. Changing, it rests, he says in fragment 84. Again, fire as a metaphor, that it's always changing and it always abides. And in fact, two of his most famous utterances refer to this very same idea. The first, "Panta re, kai uden mene," all things flow and nothing remains. And this is a point that is even more forcefully affirmed in what is arguably the most celebrated piece of metaphor by Heraclitus. "You cannot step into the same river twice, for new waters are ever flowing on." We step and we do not step into the same rivers. We are and are not. The unified, ordered world of balanced change is also the world in which the laws or norms of justice prevail. As we read in fragment 28b, "Justice will catch up with fabricators of falsehoods and those who bear witness to them." More generally, such norms can be described as divine law in nature, a law that is common in its accessibility and its applicability. Those who speak with understanding must hold fast to what is common to all, as a city holds to its law, and even more strongly, says Heraclitus in fragment 114. "For all human laws are fed by the one divine law. It prevails as much as it will, and suffices for all things with something to spare." But the justice that is cosmic law is the justice of disruption and revolution, of war and violence, not that of balm and healing. "One must realize," Heraclitus says, "we must know that war is common to all and strife is justice, and that all things come into being and pass away through strife." Elsewhere, he puts it thus in fragment 53, "War is the father of all and the king of all, and some he has made gods and some men, some bond and some free." If this strikes us as paradoxical, it is because of our failure to recognize the different perspective that a God's eye view necessarily has of reality, Heraclitus asserts. To God, he says in fragment 102, all things are fair and good and just, whereas humans suppose whereas humans have supposed that some things are unjust and other things just. According to such a God's eye view for Heraclitus, all change, however violent, be it macro changes of nature and the outer cosmos or war among states or civic strife or the battles that rage in the human heart, can all be seen as integral parts of that same law, that logos that steers all things, that we read in fragment 41, producing through change that higher unity, which is the cosmos. So it's an idea that one might say is very similar to, say, the yin and yang idea of the East. And there have been a lot of studies about the impact of Eastern philosophies on Heraclitus's thought. He did live in Asia Minor. It was kind of at a crossroads between East and West, between Greece and the Orient in the broad sense of the term of just the East. And there are, I know, at least of one study I can think of that kind of does a comparison and contrast with Heraclitus's idea and that of the Tao from Lao Tzu. So This is very much in harmony with that. And we might just notice that while there is obviously a lot here that, and we will talk about this in subsequent lectures, about so much here that obviously will be consonant with Christianity, especially the Logos philosophy. There is also there are aspects of it that are clearly at variance with Christianity, because this idea of the harmonization of good and evil, of war and peace, and violence and strife with order and so on, and this kind of yin and yang idea, that clearly is not a Christian idea. Two problems remain. Um, and they remain, I should say, a great matter of dispute. Whether Heraclitus believed in the constant interchange of four elemental masses of material in the universe, that would be in the classic understanding earth, fire, air, and water, or simply three, earth, fire, and water. And whether the second question is whether his philosophy included a theory of the periodic conflagration or ekpyrosis of the sum of all things, which was certainly an idea of the later Stoic philosophers who took so much from Heraclitus, not least of which was their Logos philosophy. And they believed in this idea of the periodic conflagration of all things. He probably believed in four, not three elemental masses. And the fragments, notably fragment 66, fire having come suddenly upon all things will judge and convict them. That probably can, at any rate, tolerate an interpretation in terms of a doctrine of periodic ekpyrosis, which the Stoics later believed in. But it could also possibly just be interpreted equally plausibly as well as a continuous elemental transmutation that we've seen, that fire is sort of the basis of all other physical elements in the universe. Okay, such in brief appear to be Heraclitus's broad commitments. As far as his particular beliefs are concerned, one can begin with a short description of his views on the macrocosmos. First and foremost is the prominence of the role played by fire, which we've already talked about, and more specifically of the ether, the aether, or fiery substance of the outer heaven, which, like so many of his fellow Greeks, had no difficulty, he had no difficulty equating with divinity, and particularly with cosmic justice, as we see here in fragment 66. Fire, having come suddenly upon all things, will judge and convict them. Fire is apparently both the arche, of which the universe's other elemental masses are transmutations, as we saw already in fragments 31a and b, and likewise in fragment 90, all things are an exchange for fire, and fire for all things, even as wares for gold and gold for wares. And especially fire in its macrocosmic manifestations is a directive force that guarantees that such changes take place according to a rational and predictable patterns. Again, fragments 31a and b. The transformations of fire are first of all sea, and half of the sea is earth, half whirlwind. The sea is poured forth from earth and is measured in the same proportion as existed before it became earth. The thunderbolt, he says, steers the totality of all things, as we've already seen. In its most perfect manifestation, ether, and in the most impressive manifestation of ether's activity, the thunderbolt, ever-living fire not only symbolizes, but is that justice or wisdom which is both willing and unwilling to be called by the name Zeus. The mention of Zeus, the supreme god, is important. Manifestations of fire other than ether and the thunderbolt will also manifest and symbolize divinity, but divinity of a lesser power or stature. The sun, for instance, he says, will not overstep his measures. Otherwise, the avenging furies, the ministers of justice, will find him out. The sun's role, however, in the scheme of things is still pivotal. Despite the smallness of its size, we read in fragment 3 that the sun is the width of a human foot, which makes sense if you think about it. It's up there in the sky. It looks rather small, from our point of view, and it's going. And the sun is going to perform the role. It has the ongoing power to perform the role that it has, which is perhaps to be traced to its daily rejuvenation, which he talks about in fragment 6. The sun is new every day. In the matter of controlling the seasons that bring all things, the later writer Plutarch maintained that according to Heraclitus, Zeus actually shared in the task with the sun. As he said, if there were no sun, it would be night on account of the other stars. And a famous fragment catches its importance as the lightener of cosmic darkness. That is, that is this one, fragment 99. For other putatively Heraclitean views on astronomy and the macrocosmos, we have only secondary sources to guide us, and they do not always agree on the details. It seems, however, reasonable to believe that for Heraclitus, sun, moon, and stars consisted of concentric bowls, the contents of which were fed by exhalations from the sea. Most of the time, the bowls had their concave side turned towards the earth. Eclipses are caused when the concave side of the sun or moon was turned upwards and the bowl turns and slopes sideways. Of the astral bodies, the stars and furthest away, the stars are the furthest away, which is why they give less light and warmth. The moon is the nearest astral body and is not a citizen of the realm of pure ether that the sun and stars inhabit. As for other celestial phenomena, thunder is caused by the aggregation of winds and clouds and the crashing of masses of air into the clouds. Lightning is caused by the act of kindling of what gets burned, and hurricanes are caused by burnings and dousings rushing down from the clouds. In all of this, Heraclitus never budges from a basic commitment to the belief in what is known as hylozoism, or the fact that the entire world and matter is sort of alive and animated. This is a belief espoused by his predecessors and contemporaries. The macro and microcosms are alive, and the principle and sustainer of this life is soul. So much is easy to say, but a full understanding of soul is beyond us, according to Heraclitus. One would never discover the limits of soul, even if one should traverse every road. So deep a logos does it possess. Some things can nonetheless be said. Soul, for Heraclitus, it seems, is not simply a principle of life. In humans, it is the principle of rationality. As he says in fragment 117, whenever a man is drunk, he is led along stumbling by a beardless boy. He does not perceive where he is going because his soul is wet. Of course, wet being the opposite of on fire. The degree of the soul's rationality depends, therefore, on its in similitude to fire, to its dryness. A flash of light, Heraclitus says. It is death for souls to become water, and death to water to become earth, but water comes from earth, and from water, soul. Now, the soul is therefore a material substance, born initially of water and ranging in character from air to fire. The degree of its rationality, as I say, depends on the quality of its dryness. A flash of light, says Heraclitus, is a dry soul, wisest and best. The air that constitutes the soul of the drunken man, as we saw in fragment 117, is sodden and close to that point at which it condenses to form water and ceases to be soul at all. For souls, it is death to become water, as we saw in fragment 36. This process, he wryly admits, can also be very pleasurable. For souls, it is a joy, or it is joy or death to become wet. The soul of the best and wisest person, by contrast, consists of air that is dry, and the reward for the brave death in battle is, in particular, is transformation of the warrior's soul into that of a guardian demigod. That is, the transformation from dry air to something still higher on the scale of rationality and divinity. Ether, that is, ether, the ultimate in dryness. War, he says, fragment 53, shows some men to be gods. The rationality of the soul is also, as it happens, a currency that circulates freely and is used with particular abandon by our passions, says Heraclitus. It is difficult, it is hard to fight with passion, for whatever it wishes, it buys at the cost of its own soul, fragment 85. But whatever the difficulty, passion, and particularly the passion of hubris, must be resisted. Hubris needs putting out even more than a house on fire, we read in fragment 43. The hubris in question is apparently that of setting oneself above the law, and according to Heraclitus, the people must fight for its law as for its city wall. And one is, in fragment 49, it is law too to obey the counsel of a single one. Furthermore, one man is 10,000 to me if he be the best. This is a point apparently missed by the people of Ephesus, Heraclitus' own city, as Heraclitus says, the adult Ephesians should hang themselves and leave the city to adolescents, for they have cast out Hermodorus, the best man among them, saying, quote, we will have none who is best among us. If there be any such, let him be so elsewhere and among others. Some people, he mentions, Bios of Priene, are quite simply of more account, that is, of more logos, than others, as in fragment 39. In Priene lived Bias, son of Teutomus, who is of more account, more logos, than the rest. For Heraclitus, such people, whom he calls the best or the most notable, choose one thing in place of all other things, ever-flowing glory among immortals. For even the best among them choose one thing above all others, ever-flowing glory among mortals, while most of them are glutted like beasts. The aristocratic prejudice hinted at here, which I mentioned in my introduction, which was a commonplace of his day, seems also reinforced elsewhere, as when he says in fragment 104, for what thought or wisdom have they? They follow the poets and take the crowd as their teacher, knowing not that there are many bad and few good. This is a refrain that one hears oftentimes, the majority which is contrasted, the majority which are bad, but to be contrasted with the minority that are the best, who and those majority glut themselves, as we saw, like beasts. However, some sympathy for the feelings of the ruled may occasionally have stirred Heraclitus, as when he says in fragment 84:5, weariness is toiling for the same people and being ruled by them. The virtue of the best men is for Heraclitus, as for so many other Greeks, most clearly manifested on the battlefield. Gods and mankind honor those who are slain by Ares, fragment 24. Not all death, however, is noble, and the problem of how ordinary people deal with their own death prompts Heraclitus to a statement of peculiar poignancy. When they are born, they wish to live and to meet with their dooms, or rather to rest, and they leave children behind them to meet with their dooms in turn, fragment 20. As for death as such, his views on the matter are expressed in ways that continue to defy universally accepted interpretation. On the one hand, he seems committed to the view that certain souls can, by such abuses as drunkenness, be destroyed, as we've already seen. Fragment 36 is death for souls to become water, and also fragment 117, when a man is drunk, his soul is wet. But on the other hand, the souls of the best seem to be assured of divination and immortality, as in fragment 53, war is the father of all and the king of all, and some war has made gods and some men, some bond and some free. Again, fragment 62, mortals, immortals, immortals, mortals, the one living, the other's death, and dying, the other's life. And lastly, in fragment 63, that they rise up and become the wakeful guardians of the living and the dead. Not all souls, then, are assured of a hereafter. Those that do achieve it, however, do not fall into a sleep of death. Their new life is one to which they, in fact, awake. Fragment 21, all the things we see when awake are death, even as all we see in slumber are sleep. And likewise, fragment 63 again, they rise up and become the wakeful guardians, you see, wakeful guardians of the living and the dead. Those who have attained this immortality kindle for themselves a light to illuminate the surrounding darkness. Fragment 26, man kindles a light for himself in the nighttime, when he has died but is alive. The sleeper, whose vision has been put out, lights up from the dead. He that is awake lights up from the sleeping. What awaits them in their new state, they can hardly even guess at. Fragment 27. There await men when they die such things as they look not for nor dream of. One such a prize may be that whatever other perceptible losses one may suffer at death, one sense at least, that of smell, will remain active, as we hear in fragment 98. Souls smell in Hades. Another surprise will be that justice, that in the afterlife, if not earlier, quote, will catch up with fabricators of falsehoods and those who bear witness to them, fragment 28b. Some of Heraclitus's views can be cautiously pieced together by comparative inference, since a good deal of his time is spent ridiculing and lampooning others for what he takes to be their foolish notions. The great poets of Greece, for example, Hesiod and Homer, are no guide to wisdom, nor are the popular bards who recite their poetry. Fragment 42, Homer deserves to be taken out of the games and beaten with a stick, and Archilochus too, another poet of the archaic age. Others, like Hesiod, who were considered the teachers of Greece, as Homer was too, and yet for Heraclitus, his ignorance was such that he continually failed to recognize any of the logos, that day and night are what they are, for they are one. Fragment 57. Hesiod is most men's teachers. Men are sure he knew very many things, a man who did not know day or night, that they are one. Even Homer, who was wiser than all the Greeks, could be on occasion equally deceived. Fragment 56. Men allow themselves to be deceived as Homer was, who yet was wiser than all the Greeks. For some boys killing lice deceived him, saying, what we see and catch we leave behind. What we neither see nor catch we take with us. So what discernment or intelligence is shown by those who use such people as their guide? What thought or wisdom have they? They follow the poets and take the crowd as their teacher, knowing not that there are many bad and few good. The same scorn is heaped by Heraclitus on other Greek philosophers. Pythagoras, in particular, is singled out as the chief captain of swindlers, fragment 81a. One of his errors, shared by several, was to assume that polymathy, that is, the learning of many things, could lead to understanding. But as Heraclitus says in fragment 40, the learning of many things, polymathia, teaches not understanding. Else would it have taught Hesiod and Pythagoras, and again Xenophanes and Hecataeus. Another error of Pythagoras lay not in his determination to investigate reality, which is in fact an imperative. Remember, men that love wisdom must be acquainted with many things indeed, but in a certain selectiveness, in that investigation which led to the construction of a private rather than a universal wisdom. Pythagoras, son of Mnesarchus, practiced inquiry beyond all other men, and making a selection of these writings, claimed for his own wisdom what was but a knowledge of many things and an imposture. As for the majority of mankind, they are just about beyond redemption for Heraclitus. Apart from the fact that the majority of people glut themselves like beasts, as we saw, and only a few of them are good, as in fragment 104. Ordinary people's religious beliefs are often illogical and absurd. Fragment 5. They vainly purify themselves by defiling themselves with blood, just as if one who had stepped into the mud were to wash his feet in mud. Any man who marked him doing thus would deem him mad. They see, but they do not notice, as we saw in fragment 1. They experience, but they do not learn from that experience. Uncomprehending even when they have heard the truth, they are like deaf people. And the saying, absent while present, fits them well, as in fragment 34. Hearing they do not understand, like the deaf. Of them does the saying bear witness, present they are absent. Like dogs, they bark at everyone that they do not recognize, fragment 97, and like donkeys, they prefer straw to gold. But their political leaders cannot escape censure for some of the misguided beliefs of the general run of mankind. What discernment or intelligence, what thought or wisdom have they? They follow the poets and take the crowd as their teacher, knowing not that there are many bad and few good. Their religious leaders, lampooned as night-wandering wizards, bacchants, Linnaeans, initiates, fragment 14, are no less worthy of castigation. As we read, the mysteries practiced among men are practiced impiously, and their singing of shameful hymns, prosta aiskra, is saved from shamefulness only by the fact that, unbeknownst to them, Dionysius, which kind of represents life and fertility, and death, represented by Hades, are one and the same. We read this in fragment 15. None of this, of course, is to suggest that for Heraclitus there are no features of popular religion that are not worthy of respect. Popular belief in the Zeus of Olympus, for example, points to the profounder truth that the world is directed by a wisdom which, as we saw, is both willing and unwilling to be called the name of Zeus. A similar pointer to the truths that comprise the Logos are the utterances of Apollo at Delphi. Fragment 93, the Lord whose oracle is at Delphi neither speaks nor hides his meaning, but gives a sign. The same can be said of the Sibyl. Mirthless though her utterances may be, the Sibyl with raving lips uttering things mirthless, unbedizened and unperfumed, reaches over 1,000 years with her voice, thanks to the God in her. Such signs will, of course, figure prominently among the many things that lovers of wisdom ought very much to be inquirers into. And it is appropriate then, in conclusion, to end with a suggestion that we will see going forward how Heraclitus will be interpreted and transformed under this by the Stoic philosophers, and how certain of the Stoic philosophers and certain of their teachings will further give intimation of essential Christian teachings. Later, such Christian thinkers as Justin Martyr and others would be able to look back at Heraclitus and see a Christian before Christ, because he had such profound insights into the nature of the Logos. And what one sees in a lot of these early Greek philosophers is their denigration of the popular religion, as we just saw with Heraclitus, but yet it was done not in a spirit of atheism, but rather in a more profound application of spirituality and in a deeper view of the divine, which, as I say, will find its ultimate fulfillment in the first words of the Gospel of John, "Enarchi in o logos." In the beginning was the Logos. Thank you.